mindfulness of the breathing.
Or notice agitation, of which there are many. Notice agitation.
Well, if you have a very, very light touch, for sure, you should be aware of what's going on. We're good? Good morning, everybody. It is Sunday, October 8th. We are here in Houston, Texas, Dawn Mountain, and we're doing an introduction to Buddhism. As I was driving over this morning, I was thinking a little bit about a 30,000-foot view of what it is we're doing. And we're doing an introduction to Buddhism, and part of that is to give us a context for understanding where Buddhism arose, how it arose, and what its diverse worldviews are, because there are a couple of different kinds of Buddhism that we're talking about. This particular phase of the introduction, we're talking about really based in Theravada Buddhism, which is the Buddhism of India, Ceylon, Burma, Thailand, parts of Laos, down into Singapore, Indonesia, and now all over the world. And it's sometimes called, it's called Theravada Buddhism. It's sometimes called foundational Nikaya Buddhism, which is the text that it's based in. From the perspective of Northern Buddhism, it's sometimes called the lesser vehicle, which is a bit pejorative, so we don't like to use it so much. And we'll explain what all of those things, why it's called that eventually. But I thought I would share with you a little experiential story and then apply it to what we're doing here. So in 1971, I was in India. It's a long time ago at this point, and I was staying in a hostel where many Ladakhi people stayed. And the Ladakhis, it's a northwest part of India is Ladakh. It's very Tibetan. So they're essentially Tibetan people. And I saw a very old Ladakhi woman. I don't know if she asked me for some Band-Aids, which I gave her. And then I saw her with the Band-Aids right here on her head. There were no cuts on her head. What I realized later was that she was using the Band-Aids for a headache. She associated Band-Aids with relieving pain and wound. And so she was putting the Band-Aids where she had pain. Now, I did not talk with her, but I'm assuming that at some level it probably helped her. But from our perspective, it's a kind of amazing transplantation of a certain kind of intervention. There's a reason I share that metaphor. We in the modern West have taken up mindfulness, and especially there's a very, very broad absorption of what's called mindfulness-based stress reduction, certainly in the therapeutic world, and it's very, very popular, and we teach mindfulness ourselves. But to the extent that mindfulness is coming into the West as a source of stress reduction, wellness, eventually even peak performance, it's a bit like the Band-Aids that the Ladakhi woman was using. Because as we will describe, the context in traditional Buddhism where mindfulness was being taught was a context of a belief in rebirth, a belief that rebirth itself was a veil of suffering, and that meditation and wisdom and mindfulness were tools for learning how to become free from the cycle of rebirth. So the tradition has mindfulness and meditation as a tool for escaping a cycle of pain. Mindfulness comes here and is absorbed into a kind of therapeutic metaphor, wellness, anti-anxiety, and even gets applied for peak performance, sexual enhancement, material enhancement. It's a very, very different usage than the tradition would have seen it for. And I highlight that because not everyone can even knows that or explains it or sees it, but it's a very, very different endeavor in the modern West and in the tradition. So having said that, I know that Lama Rigdzin came last time and got up to talking about Buddha's enlightenment and the first noble truth. And I'll pick up the story from there. So Buddha had been a young prince. He had a sheltered life. At a certain point, because his father did not want him to know anything about suffering, because that might lead him to a religious life, because he was foretold to be either a successful king or a religious world leader. Well, at a certain point, the young prince wanted to know more about life. He went out, he saw a sick person, an old person, a dead person, a corpse, and then a wandering ascetic who seemed to be very, very calm and was dedicated to becoming free from old age, sickness, and death, and the repetitive cycle of old age, sickness, and death. He took on a regimen of, left the royal palace, wandered for 6 or 7 years, studied with many, many teachers, learned meditation, practiced asceticism, which is limiting food extremely, and finally decided that that wasn't a path for success to become free of rebirth. He came to a small town called Bodh Gaya. Nowadays is just north of Gaya in the state of Bihar in India, and sat himself under a tree and said, I'm not going to move until I can become free from the cycle of rebirth. I've got to understand what the heck this is and how to get free of it. And there were a lot of temptations, both of the sensual side and also the violent side. There were visions of both very, very attractive women, and then bows and arrows and slings and swords. But he withstood all of those visions and came to understand what are called the Four Truths, which included a kind of awakening and a freeing from the cycle. He also had visions of all beings and their activities and what activities led to which rebirths. He had a very, very profound vision of the workings of karma, action, and the fruits of action. It's karma. Karma literally means action. So he realized 4 truths. The first of which is the truth of suffering. The 4 truths are suffering, the cause, that there is a cessation of suffering, and that there's a path. So when we start talking about suffering, sometimes people feel, oh, Buddhism is pessimistic and it's oriented towards suffering. But that is a mischaracterization, because it's about what are the causes of suffering, what is a cessation of suffering, and what's a path to the cessation of suffering. So what are the kinds of suffering? There are classically 3 kinds of suffering enumerated. Birth is suffering, and in some texts you can read very, very graphic descriptions of being squeezed through a very, very narrow passage. It's clearly very, very painful for the mothers who are giving birth, and it may be painful for the infant coming forth. That's how the classic authors write about it. Certainly, we can imagine that it might be a very, very painful passage. Birth is suffering. Old age is suffering. Old age, where we start seeing our faculties decrease, our hearing goes, our seeing goes, our strength goes, our stability goes, memory goes, our vitality goes. It's hard. Growing old is associated with much discomfort and unhappiness. Sickness is suffering. So much sickness recently, most of us at least know some people who've had COVID. Scary, painful, coughing, fevers, and all the ranges of sickness that any of us may encounter or have encountered, flus, ALS, polio, kidney disease, liver disease, all the cancers. Very, very painful. You know, I've worked in a hospital, enormous pain for people and people around them. And when our relatives or we ourselves get sick, it's very, very tough. It's literally pain and all the disruption that goes with that pain. And death, many, many people find dying to be very, very painful, disruptive, scary. Birth, old age, sickness, and death, universal, where pain, just the explicit painfulness of pain is present. That's the suffering of suffering. Suffering of change is even when we have a good situation, it changes. And there's discomfort, frustration involved with that. We have a beautiful weekend this weekend in Houston, finally. It's in the 70s after 105 for months. But I'm sure somewhere in the next few days or next few weeks, we'll be back to 85 with, 70% humidity, and it's just muggy and kind of uncomfortable. Comfort and pleasure change. We're at the peak of our careers, and something terrible occurs, and we lose that peak performance. We're at optimal physical condition, and that changes, and there's pain and frustration. Wonderful relationship, and things start changing, and there's pain and difficulty, upset, suffering of change. And then there's this unsatisfactoriness of conditioning. Within Buddhism, there's a lot of talk of causes and conditions. And if we think about it, everything we know is dependent on causes and conditions. This table, it itself is made up of many parts, so those are causes and conditions. And then there were all the people who went into building the table. Those were part of the causes and conditions for building the table. And anything that is dependent on causes and conditions is unstable. It's going to come apart. It's variable. It's not dependable. And therefore, it's at some profound level not satisfactory. So in terms of all conditioned phenomena, our bodies, our minds, we can experience either the suffering of pain, if you like, the suffering of change, and the suffering of being conditioned, not dependable. So what's the cause of all of this round of unsatisfactoriness? Well, the fuel in the Buddhist perspective is kind of craving and clinging in the mind. You know, the best metaphor for this kind of craving and clinging that I saw in the literature, and it's in a commentary, but if you take a piece of raw meat and you have a hot iron skillet, no oil, and you put the raw meat on the hot skillet, it will stick really, really hard. It'll be like stuck to the skillet. And so within the Buddhist perspective, when we get stuck clinging to things, that mental process is the source for our rebirth. Now that, of course, is a bit of a mystery, but that's what Buddha recognized, was that stuck today on things as raw meat to a hot skillet, where our mind gets just totally glommed into something, that's the fuel for rebirth. And with rebirth, we get the pain of birth, we get old age, we get sickness, and we get death. So, dependent on the cause, we get the effect. Clinging. Now, clinging includes the depth of aversion, because aversion is just a kind of reverse form of clinging. And it's also clinging to becoming, namely, I just want to continue to exist forever with a very, very strong stuckness, or I want to cease to exist, but clinging to, I want to cease to exist. But the clinging, the intense stuckness is the fuel for rebirth. Even wanting to not become, if you're really stuck on it, you're going to be fueling a process of coming back. So this is very, very much within the Indic worldview that rebirth is a painful process. It's a kind of powerless process until you get your mind around it. It's perpetual, it's kind of out of awareness, and it's fueled by clinging. And within the tradition, in some ways, sexual clinging comes in for the highest potential for creating the seeds of rebirth. So the Buddhist practice evolved into a celibate order so that monastics would not be involved with sexual desire, sexual clinging. Now there were, of course, many, many lay people, and there are still many lay people. Hello. And, we're just advised to be very, very aware of the operation of sexual desire. But certainly within the origin story, sexuality is illustrated as the el primo source of clinging, and working with that becomes a very, very major focus for monastics, male and female, to disrupt the cycle, to become free of that involvement with sexual desire. For lay people, it's to do things within a kind of boundary, maybe a boundary of one relationship. So I bring this up in part to draw a certain kind of contrast with, mindfulness-based stress reduction. You're not going to hear anything about sexuality and desire and clinging when you go to a 10-day course on mindfulness-based stress reduction. But culturally, that's why we have monks and nuns. Sexuality was seen as a great, great source of clinging and the pains of rebirth. So clinging to sensual desire, aversion associated with frustrations of sensual desire, craving and clinging for becoming, and craving and clinging for not becoming. This is the fuel for rebirth. But then the third truth is that there is a cessation. In the tradition is called the remainderless fading and cessation, renunciation, relinquishment, release, and letting go of that very craving. So it's interesting, part of that is on the training side, there is kind of a mindful, intentional letting go of craving. There are meditations to reduce craving. There are practices to reduce craving. They wouldn't have put it in these terms, but the monks basically go begging for the food, and they traditionally, monks ate in the morning and in the afternoon and not after that. If you consume, this is modern scientific stuff, if you consume less than 1,300 calories a day, your libido is going to go to hell. And so they would be eating not a lot. They would be eating what people offered them in their bowl, morning and afternoon, and they would not eat after about noon. And that has a profound effect. That's a behavioral working with craving and clinging. Meditation is another way of working with the sources of clinging and the experience of clinging. And if one's meditation is conjoined with insight and one really begins to understand the workings of the mind, not only do you see the workings of the mind, but there is a process and stages of practice where the seeds of, the engine of clinging actually gets uprooted. And so it's no longer that you've got to effortfully be working with desire and clinging and really getting stuck on things. It's just naturally the case that your mind is free. Technically, you've become familiar with what's called nirvana, which is the cessation of both the sources of suffering and any experiences of suffering. With that particular profound message, we'll take just a minute break to move between introduction to Buddhism to move into our practice of meditation.